My name is Rebecca. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe as steady, not flashy, not loud, dependable. The person you trust with details, with deadlines, with things that matter quietly in the background. I've built my career in professional environments where being composed is praised and being emotional is politely punished. Where you're told, sometimes directly, sometimes through glances and silences, that if you just keep your head down and do good work, it will all be noticed eventually. That's usually how people see me. Capable, calm, agreeable. Someone who doesn't cause friction. Someone who doesn't need much reassurance or recognition. And because I don't demand the spotlight, it's easy to assume I don't want it, or worse, that I don't deserve it. I stayed silent while my coworker took my promotion. And before you assume where that's going, let me be clear about what it isn't. This is not a story about revenge. There's no dramatic blow-up, no shouting match in a conference room, no last-minute villain reveal. It's not about humiliating anyone or winning in the way we usually imagine winning. It's about something much quieter and much more uncomfortable. The cost of staying silent when silence feels like professionalism. For a long time, I believed that silence was maturity, that letting things slide was strategic, that correcting people would make me seem difficult, and waiting would make me seem trustworthy. I told myself I was playing the long game. What I didn't realize, what I didn't want to realize, was summed up later in a sentence that still sits heavy with me. I thought silence was professional. It was just expensive. This story will take you through a slow, emotional journey. It starts with how I was perceived at work, how small dismissals crept in disguised as nothing, and how I learned to normalize being overlooked without ever calling it what it was. You'll hear about the moment something shifted inside me, not in anger, but in clarity. And you'll hear how staying silent didn't mean staying passive, even when everyone around me thought it did. I'm telling this story in my own words, exactly as I experienced it. Not to dramatize it, and not to rewrite myself as a hero. Just to be honest about what it costs to always be the reasonable one, the patient one, the one who waits her turn in rooms where turns aren't actually being given. If you've ever wondered whether being quiet is a strength or just a habit, if you've ever felt that uncomfortable tension between dignity and self-erasure, then maybe some part of this story will feel familiar to you. Have you ever stayed silent because you believed it was the right thing to do, even when something in you knew it wasn't free? At work, I was the person people described in practical terms. Rebecca's solid. She's reliable. If anyone knows how that process works, it's her. Those were compliments, technically. They were said with nods, not enthusiasm. With certainty, not curiosity. No one ever said, Rebecca's going places, or Rebecca's one to watch. I wasn't framed as potential. I was framed as infrastructure. I had been with the company long enough that my presence felt permanent, almost invisible. I knew how things really moved. Not the official workflows in onboarding decks, but the shortcuts, the dependencies, the unspoken approvals. When something broke, someone would inevitably say, "Let's ask Rebecca." And when it was fixed, the conversation moved on. In meetings, I spoke when it was necessary. Not to hear my own voice, not to perform. I came prepared. I answered questions clearly, and then I stopped. I didn't interrupt. I didn't circle back to reclaim ideas. I assumed, wrongly it turns out, that clarity spoke for itself. People often mistook my calm for contentment. Because I wasn't visibly frustrated, they assumed I wasn't ambitious. Because I didn't self-promote, they assumed I didn't need advancement. I was efficient enough that no one worried about me leaving, vocal enough that no one thought I was disengaged, and quiet enough that no one felt threatened. That combination made me very easy to overlook. When new hires joined, I was introduced as someone who'll help you get up to speed. Not as someone whose role they might one day grow into, but as someone who would steady them while they did. I trained managers who would later manage me. I filled gaps during transitions that never officially counted as leadership, and I told myself this was fine. I told myself that visibility would come later, that this phase, this being useful without being seen, was temporary. I believed in earned recognition, in the idea that if you were patient and consistent, the system would eventually correct itself. I didn't notice how neatly I had been categorized. To them, I was safe. I wouldn't challenge decisions publicly. I wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions in meetings. I wouldn't make anyone look unprepared. I absorbed extra work with a nod and a calendar adjustment. I answered Slack messages quickly and emails thoroughly. I was dependable in a way that didn't disrupt anyone else's momentum. And because of that, I wasn't part of the future conversations. I wasn't invited into informal strategy chats. I wasn't pulled aside with, "We're thinking of you for something." When people talked about leadership, they talked around me, not through me. My name existed in the present tense only, never the conditional, never the aspirational. Looking back, what strikes me most is not that they underestimated me. It's what I helped them do. Every time I stayed quiet to keep the peace, every time I let credit drift away because correcting it felt awkward, I reinforced the version of myself they already believed in. The version that didn't need acknowledgement. The version that would always be there, doing the work, regardless of who stood in front of it. I wasn't mistreated. Not overtly. No one raised their voice at me or dismissed me outright. That's what made it harder to name. Invisibility doesn't announce itself. It just settles in, slowly, until you forget what being seen feels like. At the time, I would have told you I was respected. Now I understand I was relied upon, and there's a difference. The first time it happened, it was small enough to ignore. That's important to say, because if it had been obvious, if it had been loud or cruel or public, I would have reacted differently. I would have had language for it. Instead, it arrived dressed as a normal collaboration. We were in a midweek planning meeting, the kind that's supposed to be procedural. Agenda on screen. Coffee is going cold, half the room half listening. I had spent the previous week untangling a bottleneck that had quietly slowed one of our core projects for months. Nothing glamorous, just careful analysis, a few conversations across departments, and a workaround that saved both time and budget. When my turn came, I explained it clearly, not dramatically. I walked through the issue, the constraint everyone had accepted as fixed, and the adjustment I'd made to move around it. A few heads nodded. Someone typed. The meeting moved on. 10 minutes later, my coworker, Ethan, circled back to it. He repeated the idea. Not word for word, but close enough that I felt that strange internal jolt of recognition. Same insight, same solution, just delivered with more confidence, more certainty, and a slightly louder voice. "And I think that could really streamline things," he said, leaning back in his chair. "We should explore that direction." The room reacted differently this time. People looked up. The manager nodded more deliberately. Someone said, "That's a good point." Another added, "Yeah, that could be a game changer." No one looked at me. I remember the exact second I considered speaking up. It would have been easy. A simple, "Yes, that's what I was suggesting earlier." Or even, "Glad we're aligned." That's the approach I mentioned. Not confrontational, just factual. But the moment passed. I told myself it wasn't worth interrupting the flow, that correcting it might seem petty, that everyone probably understood it came from me anyway. I assumed intent mattered more than attribution. That assumption would cost me more than I realized. After the meeting, nothing happened. No follow-up message. No acknowledgement. The idea was now loosely associated with Ethan, not because anyone consciously reassigned it, but because he had been the last one to say it, confidently, and without hesitation. I noticed it. Everyone else forgot it instantly. That's the thing about these moments. They don't register as events. They leave no paper trail. No one else replays them on the commute home. But they leave a mark on the person they happen to. I told myself it was a one-off. that Ethan hadn't done it intentionally, that he was enthusiastic, not opportunistic. I didn't want to assign malice where carelessness would do, so I stayed quiet. In the weeks that followed, the idea reappeared in conversation, always framed as something Ethan's been thinking about. I watched it get refined, discussed, and praised. Each time I felt that same tightening in my chest, followed by the same rationalization. It's not that big a deal. The work matters more than the credit. This is how teams function. What I didn't say out loud, even to myself, was that something had shifted. Before, I believed that good work naturally found its owner. After that meeting, a crack formed in that belief. A thin one, easy to plaster over with professionalism and patience, but there nonetheless. I didn't confront Ethan. I didn't bring it up with my manager. I didn't even change how I behaved in meetings. I continued exactly as before, convinced that consistency would protect me. Looking back, that was the real cut. Not the moment my idea was taken, but the moment I taught everyone, including myself, that it could be. After that first incident, I became very good at explaining things away. Not to other people. There was nothing to explain to them, but to myself. I developed a quiet internal language that smoothed over discomfort before it could harden into anger. It sounded mature, reasonable, professional. I told myself that collaboration was messy by nature. Those ideas overlap. That timing matters. That confidence often reads as leadership, whether or not it should. None of those things was untrue. But together, they formed a convenient shield against a truth I wasn't ready to face. The behavior didn't repeat immediately. That would have made it easier to name. Instead, it returned intermittently, just often enough to feel familiar. An observation I made in a meeting would resurface later in an email thread, attributed to a discussion Ethan and I had. A process I designed would be referenced as something the team decided, with his name attached when results were presented upward. My role remained technical, supportive, adjacent, never central. Each time I noticed, each time I stayed silent. What changed was not the behavior around me, but my threshold for it. The first time had surprised me. The second time confused me. By the third or fourth, I began to expect it. An expectation has a way of dulling reaction. I started editing myself preemptively. In meetings, I would soften my language, framing ideas as questions instead of statements. Maybe one option could be, "I'm not sure if this makes sense, but..." It felt polite. It also made it easier for someone else to pick up the thread and carry it forward with more certainty. When that happened, I told myself it was my fault for not being assertive enough. That belief was particularly insidious because it sounded like accountability. It felt empowering to think, I can fix this by adjusting myself. What it actually did was keep me focused inward, constantly calibrating my tone, my timing, my delivery, while ignoring the pattern forming around me. Ethan, meanwhile, grew more visible. He wasn't louder in an obnoxious way. He was just present, comfortable speaking in unfinished thoughts, willing to claim space even when he hadn't fully earned it yet. When he didn't know something, he guessed confidently. When he did know something, often because I had explained it to him, he stated it as fact. Management responded well to that energy. They saw initiative, leadership potential, momentum. I saw something else, but I didn't give it a name. Instead, I rationalized. I told myself that Ethan needed visibility more than I did, that I was already secure, that drawing attention to myself would seem unnecessary, even ungrateful. I had internalized the idea that ambition, in someone like me, required justification, and so I adapted. I took on more behind-the-scenes work, more cleanup, more preparation so others could perform well in meetings. I became even more indispensable in ways that were difficult to quantify. When deadlines were met, it was the team. When strategies were praised, it was strong leadership. When something went wrong, it was often quietly traced back to me, with the assumption that I would fix it. I didn't protest that either. There's a particular kind of loneliness in this phase. Not the kind that comes from being excluded, but the kind that comes from being included in everything except recognition. You're always in the room, always part of the conversation, and yet somehow never the subject of it. The most dangerous part was how normal it began to feel. I stopped feeling the initial sting. In its place was a low, steady ache, manageable, ignorable. I told myself this was adulthood, that work wasn't about validation. I was lucky to have stability, respect, and trust. And I did have those things. What I didn't have was authorship over my own contributions. By staying quiet, by choosing peace over precision, I was slowly consenting to a version of myself that others found convenient. Not because they asked me to, but because I never corrected them. The disrespect wasn't loud enough to demand confrontation. It was subtle enough to invite accommodation. And I accepted that invitation again and again, until accommodation began to look like agreement. I didn't realize it at the time, but this was the moment the narrative about me had settled. I was no longer someone whose work spoke for itself. I was someone whose silence spoke for me. Roles don't usually arrive with announcements. No one sat me down and said, "This is who you are now." There was no memo, no title change, no explicit boundary drawn. The role I was assigned emerged gradually, through repetition, expectation, and my own cooperation. I was the reliable one, not the visionary, not the rising leader. The reliable one, the person you loop in when things are fragile, when details matter, when failure would be inconvenient. The person you trust not to make noise. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. In meetings, I was asked to sense-check ideas that others proposed, to flag risks, refine timelines, and identify dependencies. My input was valued, but only as a filter, not as a source. I was there to make sure things didn't go wrong, not to decide where things should go. When leadership opportunities came up, they were framed in a particular way around me. "Rebecca's great where she is. She's the glue." We couldn't afford to lose her in that role. On the surface, these sounded like praise. Underneath, they functioned as containment. I was too useful to move, too stable to promote. My competence had become a reason to keep me exactly where I was. Ethan's role, by contrast, was fluid. He was allowed to experiment, to pitch half-formed ideas, to step into visibility even when he stumbled. His mistakes were framed as learning curves. Mine, when they happened, were framed as anomalies. Surprising, concerning, in need of quiet correction. I noticed how often people deferred to him in discussions that touched areas I knew more deeply. I noticed how easily his confidence filled the space I had vacated, and I noticed how no one questioned it, because from the outside, the story made sense. He looked like a leader. I looked like support. The most unsettling realization was that I had helped script this dynamic by absorbing extra work without renegotiation, by correcting issues privately instead of publicly, by prioritizing harmony over authorship. I had made it very easy for others to step forward, because I was always stepping back. There's a particular invisibility that comes from being the one who can handle it. People stop asking how you're doing. They stop imagining you elsewhere. They stop worrying about your trajectory, because you seem settled, even when you're not. At one point during a performance review, my manager told me, "You're incredibly dependable. You don't need much direction." It was meant as a compliment. I smiled. I thanked her. What I didn't say was that I needed direction because I wanted to grow. That I needed a challenge, not just trust. That being left alone wasn't the same as being supported. But that wasn't the role I had been given. I was the stabilizer, the quiet constant, the person whose ambition, if it existed, was assumed to be modest. And challenging that assumption felt risky. I worried that asserting myself would feel abrupt, even ungrateful, that it would disrupt the equilibrium I had helped create. There was a subtle pressure to remain consistent, not just in performance, but in personality. So I complied. I continued to show up prepared, composed, and careful. I maintained the image that had been built around me, even as it grew increasingly misaligned with who I was becoming inside. The cost of that misalignment didn't show up all at once. It accumulated in small moments, hesitations, swallowed sentences, opportunities I didn't reach for because they didn't seem meant for me. I hadn't been pushed into a corner. I had been gently guided into one, and I stayed there longer than I should have, because I believed that stepping out would require permission I didn't know how to ask for. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no revelation delivered in a single sentence, no dramatic injustice that forced my hand. In fact, if you had been watching me that day, you would have seen the same thing everyone else always saw. Me listening, taking notes, nodding at the right moments. The shift happened internally, in a space no one else had access to. It was during a quarterly review meeting with senior leadership, one of those sessions where outcomes are summarized and future direction is discussed in broad strokes. I was there because I always was. My role was to provide context if needed, to clarify operational details, and to answer questions if they came up. Ethan was presenting. He stood at the front of the room, confident, relaxed, clicking through slides that looked familiar. Not because he had stolen them outright, but because I recognized the structure, the framing. The logic of the process changes is being highlighted. They were mine. Not exclusively, nothing ever is, but built on months of work I had led quietly, conversations I had initiated, risks I had mitigated, systems I had held together long enough for someone else to stand on them and explain them clearly. As he spoke, I watched the room respond. Senior leaders leaned forward. Someone smiled. Another asked a question that assumed ownership. "How did you decide to approach it that way?" they asked him. And Ethan answered smoothly. He spoke as if the decisions had been his to make, as if the path had been obvious, as if the groundwork had appeared naturally beneath his feet. I felt something tighten in my chest, not sharp, not explosive, just firm. And for the first time, I didn't rush to explain it away. I didn't tell myself this was normal. I didn't tell myself it didn't matter. I didn't tell myself my time would come. Instead, I noticed a quieter, more unsettling thought form fully. If I say nothing now, this becomes the official version. That was the moment. Not anger, not jealousy, clarity. I looked down at my notebook, the same one I always carried, pages filled with dates, decisions, names, and sequences. Evidence of my involvement that no one had ever asked to see, because I had never offered it. I realized that my silence had been doing more than keeping the peace. It had been editing me out of the story. For the rest of the meeting, I didn't speak. Not because I was shrinking, but because I was observing. I watched how easily narratives solidified when unchallenged, how quickly leadership aligned around the most visible voice in the room, how little curiosity there was about what happened behind the scenes. And I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. Professionalism, as I had practiced it, was incomplete. It prized restraint without accounting for consequence. It assumed fairness without requiring structure. It rewarded confidence far more reliably than contribution. When the meeting ended, several people congratulated Ethan. He smiled, thanked them, and gestured vaguely toward the team. "Couldn't have done it without everyone," he said. Everyone. I gathered my things and left the room quietly, just as I always did. But the person walking out was not the same one who had walked in. That evening, I didn't vent. I didn't call a friend to complain. I didn't draft an email in my head that I would never send. I sat with the discomfort. I replayed the pattern. Not just this meeting, but all the ones before it. I saw how consistently I had chosen invisibility because it felt safer than asserting presence. How I had mistaken being agreeable for being strategic. And I acknowledged, for the first time, a truth that was both sobering and empowering. No one was going to correct this on my behalf. Not because they were malicious, but because the version of me they knew didn't require correction. I had trained them well. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I didn't decide what I would do next. Not yet. But I did decide one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever silence I chose from this point forward would be deliberate. And that changed everything. After that meeting, something subtle but important changed in how I held my silence. Before, It had been reflexive, automatic, a default setting shaped by years of conditioning and reinforced by praise for being easy to work with. I stayed quiet because it felt safer, because it preserved harmony, because it kept me from being misunderstood. Now silence required intention. I didn't announce any shift. I didn't suddenly become outspoken or confrontational. From the outside, nothing about my behavior would have registered as different. I still attended the same meetings. I still delivered on the same deadlines. I still spoke when asked. What changed was the internal calculus. I stopped offering context preemptively. I stopped filling in gaps before they were noticed. I stopped rescuing conversations from ambiguity. When someone made an assumption based on incomplete information I had previously supplied automatically, I let it sit. Not out of spite, but out of observation. I wanted to see what happened when I didn't smooth the edges. What happened was instructive. Decisions slowed. Questions multiplied. Small errors surfaced that I had once prevented quietly. And instead of rushing in to correct them behind the scenes, I documented them. Carefully, neutrally, with dates and outcomes. People mistook this silence for withdrawal, for passivity. I heard it in the tone of follow-up messages. Just checking in. Wanted to make sure you're aligned. Let us know if you have any concerns. I had concerns. I just wasn't donating them for free anymore. Ethan, in particular, seemed to interpret my restraint as deference. He stepped more confidently into spaces I had vacated, offering opinions with less grounding than before. Where I once would have quietly course-corrected him, I now let his suggestions stand on their own. Management noticed the increased friction, but not its source. They assumed it was complexity, or growth pains, or external pressure. No one traced it back to my absence in the background, because no one had fully understood how much weight I had been carrying there. This was the paradox of my position. I was invisible when present, but my absence created ripples. I still didn't speak up to claim credit. Not yet. That wasn't the point. The point was to understand the system I was operating in, how narratives formed, how decisions hardened, how accountability flowed. And the more I watched, the clearer it became. Silence, in this environment, was never neutral. When I had been silent before, others filled the space with assumptions that benefited them. When I was silent now, I was watching those assumptions collide with reality. I started organizing my work differently, not to show off, but to prepare. I kept records of what I owned versus what I supported. I tracked where decisions originated and where they were presented. I noted which contributions were visible and which were quietly absorbed. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accuracy. Emotionally, I felt calmer than I had in months. There was relief in no longer performing agreeableness, in no longer managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. And there was power, quiet, steady power, in realizing that I had more leverage than anyone suspected. People underestimate silence when they assume it's born of fear. They don't realize how dangerous it can be when it's born of awareness. By choosing when not to speak, I was finally listening to the system, to the patterns, to myself. And what I heard was unmistakable. I didn't need to demand recognition. I needed to decide how and when to re-enter the narrative. And that decision was already taking shape. While everyone else continued as usual, I began preparing in ways no one thought to watch for. Preparation, in my case, didn't look dramatic. There were no secret meetings, no whispered phone calls, no sudden shifts in loyalty. I didn't isolate myself or signal discontent. I stayed exactly where I was, calm, competent, unremarkable. That was the advantage. People only monitor what they think might move. And no one thought I was moving. What they didn't notice was how systematically I had begun to separate my value from the role I had been assigned. For years, my work lived everywhere and nowhere. I supported multiple projects, bridged teams, and filled gaps that were never formally documented. That made me indispensable in practice, but replaceable on paper. I had allowed my contributions to blur into the background of team effort. I started reversing that, not by hoarding information, but by clarifying ownership. I updated the documentation to reflect decision points and responsible parties. I followed up meetings with written summaries that clearly attributed actions, without commentary, without emotion. Based on our discussion, I will be responsible for X. Ethan will lead Y. Simple, accurate, hard to argue with. I reviewed past projects and reconstructed timelines, not to rewrite history, but to preserve it. Dates, dependencies, emails, Slack threads, approvals, patterns. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was building a record of reality, and I did it quietly. At the same time, I began learning things that weren't required of me. Areas adjacent to my role that touched budget, compliance, and long-term planning. I asked questions that sounded like curiosity, not ambition. I scheduled conversations framed as alignment, not positioning. People are generous with information when they don't feel threatened by your trajectory. What surprised me most was how much institutional knowledge lived only in my head, and how fragile that made the organization. I had been the connective tissue for so long that entire workflows assumed my presence without acknowledging it. I stopped correcting that assumption. When someone asked, "Is this how it's always done?" I answered honestly, "This is how I've been handling it." Subtle difference. Important one. Ethan, meanwhile, continued gaining visibility. He was included in more strategic conversations, more leadership-adjacent discussions. He didn't realize how dependent those conversations were on systems I had designed and maintained. No one did. And that was the point. I wasn't trying to expose anyone. I was letting the structure reveal itself. There's a misconception that power requires dominance. In reality, power often comes from understanding how things actually work and how little redundancy exists beneath confident presentations. I documented risks I had previously absorbed. I flagged dependencies that had been managed informally. I clarified which decisions were reversible and which weren't. All of this was framed as diligence, which it was. What they never noticed was that I was also repositioning myself from invisible support to irreplaceable authority, without asking for permission. Emotionally, this phase was surprisingly quiet. There was no adrenaline rush, no sense of triumph, just focus. I wasn't angry at Ethan. He was playing the role the system rewarded. I wasn't angry at management either. They were responding to what they could see. What I was done with was being unseen by default. The more I prepared, the clearer my options became. I could confront the issue directly and risk being labeled disruptive. I could continue as before and accept the cost. Or I could let the truth emerge in a way that didn't require performance. That last option was the most demanding. It required patience, precision, and the discipline to let others misunderstand me for a while. I was no longer trying to prove my worth. I was positioning it where it couldn't be ignored. The realization didn't arrive as a surge of excitement. There was no moment where I leaned back in my chair and thought, "I've got them." No sense of victory. What came instead was something far more sobering. A quiet, unmistakable clarity about where the real leverage sat, and how casually I had been carrying it for years. It happened late one evening, long after most people had logged off. I was reviewing documentation for a project that had recently run into trouble. Leadership was confused about why timelines were slipping. Ethan had been asked to take a closer look and report back. I had already seen the issue weeks earlier, but this time, I didn't fix it automatically. Instead, I traced it. I followed the decisions backward. Not just the final ones, but the small approvals, the informal agreements, the quiet exceptions. And what emerged was a pattern so consistent it was almost unsettling. Nearly every critical junction ran through me. Not because I had authority, but because I had continuity. I was the one who remembered why something existed, what had been tried before, what constraints were real and which were assumed. I was the keeper of context, and context, I realized, was the currency everyone else was spending freely without replenishing. The company wasn't built on systems alone. It was built on memory, and I held more of it than anyone wanted to admit. I sat there, scrolling through old threads, calendars and notes in my black notebook. Not in a frantic way, just methodically. I wasn't looking for wrongdoing. I was looking for dependency. And there it was. Entire processes that had no formal owner. Decisions justified by historical reasons that no one else could fully articulate. Risk mitigations that existed only because I had quietly maintained them. I hadn't hidden this work. I had simply never framed it as leverage. That night, something settled into place. I understood that I didn't need to accuse anyone of taking my promotion. I didn't need to argue about intent or fairness. The system itself was already telling the truth, just not out loud. Ethan could present outcomes. He could speak confidently about direction. But when questions moved beyond slides, when they touched execution, sustainability, or long-term risk, those answers traced back to me, and no one had asked what would happen if I stopped providing them. This wasn't a threat, it was a fact. I felt a brief flicker of something like grief, not for the promotion itself, but for how long I had misunderstood my own position. I had believed power came from being seen as indispensable in visible ways. In reality, I had been indispensable precisely because I wasn't visible. That realization didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me careful. Because leverage, once recognized, carries responsibility. I didn't rush to use it. I didn't change my behavior overnight. I simply stopped minimizing it internally. I stopped telling myself I was just supporting. I stopped shrinking the language I used in my own head. I also stopped assuming that fairness would emerge organically. It rarely does. The reveal was private because it needed to be. The moment I externalized it prematurely, it would have turned into a performance, a negotiation of egos instead of a reckoning with reality. So I held it. I refined my understanding of it. I tested small boundaries. I watched what happened when I delayed responses, when I asked clarifying questions instead of offering solutions, and when I redirected ownership back to where it officially sat. The cracks widened, not dramatically, quietly. No alarms went off, no one panicked, but the system began to show stress in places that had once been cushioned by my presence. And still I said nothing, not because I was afraid, but because I was choosing the moment when truth would be undeniable, not debatable. That was the real reveal. Not what I discovered about them, but what I finally understood about myself. I wasn't behind. I had simply been holding the weight, and now I knew exactly what that meant. Once you see leverage clearly, you can't pretend you don't. That was the uncomfortable truth of that phase. Awareness narrowed my options instead of expanding them. I could no longer drift forward on habit or hope that things would resolve themselves. Whatever happened next would be the result of a choice. I remember sitting at my desk one morning, calendar unusually light, inbox quiet in that deceptive way that suggests something is forming elsewhere. I had been excluded from a strategy meeting. Nothing overt, just a last-minute invite list adjustment. Ethan was there. A few directors were there. I wasn't. That would have stung once. This time, it clarified. I laid out the options in my head with a precision I hadn't used before. I could confront the situation directly. Ask why I'd been overlooked. Ask why my work had been repeatedly reframed through someone else's voice. Ask why the promotion path seemed to bend around me. That route required trust, in their self-awareness, in their willingness to hear something uncomfortable, in their capacity to change course without defensiveness. I didn't have enough evidence that trust would be well placed. I could stay silent and continue as before, now fully aware of the cost. That was the safest option in the short term. No risk of being labeled difficult, no disruption, but it also meant accepting a ceiling I hadn't agreed to, and teaching myself, permanently, that clarity was optional. That option felt like erosion. The third option was less obvious and more final. I could stop compensating for a system that misattributed value. Stop buffering outcomes that weren't mine to own. Let responsibility align with authority, even if that alignment reveals uncomfortable gaps. This option didn't require confrontation. It required commitment. I thought carefully about what I wanted, not just professionally, but ethically. I didn't want to embarrass anyone. I didn't want to stage a reckoning. I didn't want to burn bridges or prove a point through damage. I wanted accuracy. I wanted a reality where contributions and consequences lined up, even if that reality took time to surface. Choosing that path meant accepting that things might get worse before they got clearer. that people might misinterpret my restraint as disengagement, that I might lose influence before regaining it in a different form. It also meant accepting that once I stopped quietly holding everything together, there was no easy way back. This was the irreversible part. You can't unsee a system's dependence on your silence. And once you stop participating in that silence, the system has to adapt or fracture. I chose to step back without announcing it, not resigning, not disengaging, just stepping back into the boundaries of my actual role, doing exactly what I was responsible for. No more, no less. I redirected questions that weren't mine to answer. I deferred decisions that weren't mine to make. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been expressed. Each action was defensible, reasonable, documented, and together they formed a shift no one could argue with. Because I wasn't doing anything wrong. Emotionally, this was the hardest part. There's a deep discomfort in watching problems you could solve unfold slowly, knowing that stepping in would restore equilibrium instantly. It feels like neglect, even when it isn't. It feels like letting people fail, even when what you're really doing is letting accountability land where it belongs. I reminded myself daily, this is not punishment, this is alignment. By the end of that week, I felt a strange calm settle in. Not relief, resolve. Whatever happened next, I would no longer be complicit in my own erasure. And that decision, once made, quietly closed every other door. From the outside, nothing looked different. That was the strange part. There was no announcement, no visible shift in posture or tone. I still arrived on time. I still responded professionally. I still delivered what I was explicitly responsible for. If anyone had been asked whether Rebecca was acting differently, most would have said no. And yet, everything was changing. Moving in silence doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing only what is yours to do, and letting the absence of everything else speak for itself. The first changes showed up in small, almost unnoticeable ways. A meeting ran 10 minutes over because no one had clarified a dependency I used to resolve in advance. A document stalled because approvals weren't aligned, and I didn't step in to broker them informally. A DA decision was made without understanding the downstream impact, and I documented the risk instead of quietly fixing it. One of these moments caused alarm. They caused mild inconvenience, confusion, follow-up. That was enough. Ethan, now firmly positioned as the visible lead, began fielding questions that used to bypass him entirely. Questions about history, about the rationale.ut edge cases. He answered some confidently, others vaguely. A few he redirected, sometimes to me, sometimes back to the group. When questions came to me, I answered carefully. I didn't over-explain. I didn't provide workarounds. I didn't absorb the responsibility that hadn't been assigned. I don't have full context on that decision, I would say. That was handled before my involvement. You'd want to check with the project owner. All true, all calm, all new. At the same time, I began having very specific conversations. Quiet ones. Not about promotion. Not about conflict. About scope. About ownership. About clarity. I want to make sure responsibilities are clearly defined, I said more than once. So nothing falls through the cracks. No one objected to that. Clarity is non-threatening when it's framed as support. Behind the scenes, I updated my own boundaries with precision. I stopped being available by default. I didn't respond instantly to every message. I scheduled time instead of squeezing things in. I treated my expertise as something to be engaged deliberately, not assumed. This wasn't withdrawal. It was recalibration. What surprised me was how long it took for anyone to notice. Weeks passed before the pattern registered as more than background noise. And even then, the discomfort was diffuse. There was no single failure to point to, just a growing sense that things felt heavier, more fragile. Leadership began asking more questions. Not accusatory ones, curious ones. Do we have documentation on this? Who owns that process now? What happens if this timeline shifts? Questions I could answer. Questions I no longer answered automatically. Instead, I pointed to records, to owners, to decisions already made. I let the structure speak. There was a moment, brief, unspoken, when I sensed the system beginning to turn its attention toward me, not with suspicion, but with something closer to recognition, not yet appreciated. Renaissance. Still, I said nothing. Moving in silence requires restraint, not just from action, but from explanation. The temptation to clarify, to make yourself understood before you're misunderstood, is strong. I resisted it, because explanation, too early, becomes negotiation. And I wasn't negotiating anymore. What I was doing was allowing the consequences of misalignment to surface naturally, without drama, without accusation, without spectacle. The irony was not lost on me. For the first time, my silence was loud enough to be heard, but only by those paying attention. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded gradually, like a tide that looks calm until you notice how far the water has moved. At first, it was confusion. Projects that had once progressed smoothly began to feel slower, heavier. Not broken, just resistant. People spent more time clarifying things that used to just work. Meetings ended with more open questions than decisions. No one panicked. Yet, Ethan was still seen as capable, still confident in front of leadership. But the space around that confidence began to thin. He was asked to explain not just what was happening, but why. To justify choices that had once gone unquestioned. He started looping me into conversations again, not as the quiet helper, but as the person who might know. His messages changed tone. Quick question. Do you remember why we decided X? Can you sanity check this? Was there a reason we avoided this approach before? I answered when it was appropriate, briefly, accurately, without filling the gaps. Sometimes my answer was, I don't recall being part of that decision. Other times, I pointed him to documentation or suggested he confirm with leadership. I didn't withhold information. I simply stopped translating it into solutions. That distinction mattered. Management began noticing the drag. Not enough to blame anyone, but enough to feel uneasy. There were side conversations, adjusted timelines, a few gentle reminders about alignment and accountability. Still, no one named the real issue, because naming it would have required acknowledging something uncomfortable, that the system had been relying on invisible labor, and that labor had boundaries now. I saw the discomfort ripple outward. People grew more cautious. Decisions slowed. Responsibility was examined more closely, sometimes for the first time. And quietly, without announcement, the narrative around Ethan shifted. He was no longer the one who has it handled. He was still figuring it out. Not failing, just no longer buoyed by unseen support. His confidence remained, but it now had weight pressing against it. I didn't feel satisfied watching this. What I felt was gravity. This was the natural outcome of misalignment correcting itself. No punishment required. No intervention necessary. One afternoon, my manager asked if I had a few minutes to talk. Her tone was neutral, curious. She asked how I was feeling about my workload, whether my scope still made sense, whether there was anything she should be aware of. I answered honestly, but selectively. I've been focused on staying aligned with my defined responsibilities, I said. I want to make sure ownership is clear across the board. She nodded, made a note. No apology, no revelation. Not yet. What was happening now was too subtle to rush. The system was recalibrating in real time, and it needed space to reveal what it had been compensating for. By the end of that month, the discomfort had become visible enough that people could feel it, even if they couldn't explain it. A project review ran longer than expected. A strategic assumption was questioned late in the process. A risk I had documented months earlier surfaced publicly. No one blamed me. No one thanked me either. That was fine. The goal was never validation. The goal was alignment. And alignment, once disturbed, doesn't settle quietly. It forces attention. By the time anyone realized something was truly wrong, the window for easy correction had already closed. That's the part people rarely understand about systems like this. They assume problems announce themselves loudly, that there's always a clear moment to step in and fix things. In reality, The most consequential shifts happen long before anyone feels alarmed. By the time concern becomes visible, momentum has already changed direction. The first real sign came during a leadership review I wasn't initially scheduled to attend. An invite appeared on my calendar that morning, added quietly, without explanation. The subject line was neutral. Project alignment check. When I joined, the tone in the room was different. Less conversational, more careful. They weren't panicking, but they were no longer confident. Questions were being asked that shouldn't have needed asking at that stage. Why certain assumptions had been made? Why hadn't specific risks been mitigated earlier? Why weren't dependencies as clean as expected? Han answered where he could. Where he couldn't, he gestured vaguely toward history, toward team decisions, toward processes that had always worked before. That was the problem. They worked before because I had been making them work, and now, without meaning to, he was revealing how little of that work he actually owned. I watched the realization move slowly across the room, not toward blame, but toward unease. No one accused him of anything. No one accused me either. Instead, there was a dawning awareness that something structural had been misunderstood. After the meeting, my manager asked if I could stay back. She closed the door, sat down, took a breath. "Help me understand," she said. "At what point did this start feeling unstable to you?" I could have said months, years. I could have explained everything, the missed attributions, the blurred ownership, the quiet reliance. I didn't. Instead, I answered precisely. "I flagged these risks when they first appeared," I said, sliding my notebook slightly forward. "They were documented. Ownership was assigned." She looked at the notes, the dates, the follow-ups. The room went very quiet. That was the moment it became clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with reassurance. The record existed. The pattern was visible. The cost of ignoring it had already been paid. Too late to fix it quietly. Too late to pretend it hadn't happened. From that point on, conversations changed tone. Not confrontational. Careful. Legal language crept in. Accountability was discussed explicitly. Roles were revisited. Ethan wasn't punished. That's important to say. He wasn't humiliated or blamed. But the confidence that had carried him was gone. Not because he lacked ability, but because the structure that had amplified it was no longer intact. He stopped speaking for the system. The system began speaking for itself. I was asked, formally now, to clarify my scope. To outline what I have been responsible for historically. Advise on how to prevent similar gaps going forward. Advice, not rescue. I gave it. What struck me most was how quickly people wanted a resolution once they understood the stakes. How eager they were to rewind, to rebalance, to make things right. But systems don't rewind. They adapt forward. The version of me who quietly absorbed everything no longer existed. And the version of them who assumed I always would had to adjust. No one said, "We should have listened sooner." They didn't have to. The silence where that sentence belonged was loud enough. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no dramatic clearing of the air. Just a closed door, 2 chairs, and a conversation that arrived late but inevitable. It was Ethan who asked to speak with me. He sent a brief message. "Do you have a few minutes today?" Polite, neutral, careful. When we sat down, he didn't start defensively. He looked tired, thoughtful, less certain than I had ever seen him. "I want to understand something," he said. "At what point did things change?" I took a moment before answering. Not to compose myself, I was calm, but to choose precision over explanation. "They didn't change suddenly," I said. "They became visible." He frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in processing. He told me he hadn't realized how much I had been carrying. That he thought we were aligned. That he assumed if something was important, I would speak up. There it was. The assumption. I didn't challenge his intent. I didn't need to. Instead, I spoke about patterns, not people. "I used to believe that too," I said. That if I stayed professional and consistent, things would sort themselves out. What I learned is that silence doesn't stay neutral for long. It gets interpreted. He nodded slowly. I told him I wasn't angry. that I didn't think he had set out to undermine me. That this wasn't about blame. It's about authorship, I said, and alignment. For a long time, those weren't matched. He asked if I had felt overlooked. Yes, I said, but more importantly, I felt mispositioned. That landed. We sat with that for a moment. No rush to resolve it. No attempt to smooth it over. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. I wish you had said something earlier. I met his eyes. I wish it had been safe to, I replied. That was the closest we came to confrontation. There was no apology offered that afternoon. None demanded. Just an acknowledgement that something fundamental had been misunderstood, and that misunderstanding had consequences. When the conversation ended, we returned to work. No grand closure. No reset button. But something had shifted permanently. For the first time, I wasn't managing his comfort, or anyone else's. I had said what was true, without heat, without performance. And that was enough. Who I am now is not louder than who I was before. That's the detail people expect to change. And it hasn't. I didn't reinvent myself as someone sharper or harder or more visibly dominant. I didn't trade composure for bravado. If anything, I'm quieter than I used to be, but in a different way. Before, my quietness was porous. It absorbed other people's expectations, other people's urgency, other people's narratives. Now it has edges. What changed wasn't my personality. It was my relationship with myself. I no longer confuse being low friction with being low impact. I no longer assume that being capable means being endlessly available. I no longer believe that restraint, by itself, signals integrity. Integrity requires alignment. These days, when I speak, it's because there's something specific to say. Not because silence feels safer. And when I don't speak, it's because I've chosen not to. Not because I'm hoping someone else will fill in the truth on my behalf. At work, my role is clearer now. Not because I demanded a spotlight, but because the boundaries around my contribution exist in writing, in scope, in expectation. People know what I own, and what I don't. They come to me deliberately, not reflexively. That shift changed how I see leadership. I used to think leadership was about visibility, confidence, and the ability to hold a room. I understand it's about authorship, about being able to trace decisions back to the people responsible for them, about creating systems that don't rely on silent labor to survive. I didn't win anything in the dramatic sense. There was no announcement that corrected the past. No moment where someone said, "You were right all along." And I don't need that now. What I gained was agency. I trust myself to notice when something feels off, and to act before that discomfort calcifies into resignation. I trust myself to name misalignment early, even if it's awkward. Especially if it's awkward. The promotion I stayed silent through taught me something more valuable than the title ever could have. That waiting to be recognized is not the same as being patient. One preserves your dignity. The other erodes it. I'm still calm, still thoughtful, still measured, but I'm no longer invisible to myself. And that has changed every room I walk into, even when no one else can quite articulate why. For a long time, I believed that professionalism meant endurance. That if I could tolerate discomfort quietly, without complaint, without correction, it would eventually be rewarded. That dignity lived in restraint, and that speaking up too soon was a kind of failure of character. What this experience taught me is more complicated. Silence is not inherently noble. It doesn't automatically make you mature, or ethical, or above the mess. Silence is a tool, and like any tool, its impact depends on how and why you use it. I stayed silent while my coworker took my promotion, not because I lacked awareness, but because I overvalued harmony and undervalued authorship. I thought that if I remained composed, the system would remain fair. It didn't. Systems don't reward quiet truth. They reward visible clarity. When clarity is missing, someone else will supply it. And the story that forms around that clarity will harden quickly. I don't regret being calm. I don't regret being thoughtful. And I don't regret choosing not to retaliate, humiliate, or dramatize what happened. C choices kept me aligned with who I am. What I do regret is how long I equated silence with professionalism, without examining the cost. Because the cost was real. It showed up in lost momentum, in misattributed work, in opportunities that passed without ever seeing my name. And once I understood that cost, I understood something else just as important. Silence that protects others at the expense of yourself is not integrity. It's self-erasure. The shift didn't come from becoming louder. It came from becoming more precise. From choosing when to speak, when to document, and when to step back so that reality could reveal itself without my intervention. There was no villain in this story, no single moment of betrayal, just a slow accumulation of assumptions, left unchallenged long enough to feel natural. And there was no dramatic victory at the end, just alignment. Alignment between what I contributed and how it was understood, between what I tolerated and what I valued, between the person I appeared to be and the person I actually was. If there's a takeaway here, it's not that you should speak up at every slight, or that silence is weakness, as that silence should never be accidental. If you are quiet, let it be intentional. If you are patient, let it be chosen, not imposed by fear or habit. And if something feels off for a long time, trust that feeling enough to examine it before it becomes expensive. I'm curious to know, have you ever stayed silent in a professional or personal situation because it felt like the right thing to do, only to realize later that it cost you more than you expected? If you're comfortable sharing, I'd love to read your experience in the comments.